Is there anything worse than dying in combat? The answer is yes. In the brutal setting of World War II, the line between humanity and barbarism was completely blurred, and acts that included the mutilation of bodies became commonplace to humiliate the enemy. For this reason, atrocious acts took place that still shock us today. Among them, we can find everything from the extraction of teeth and ears to the decapitation of Japanese soldiers by some American combatants. Motivated by hatred, fear, and a distorted war code, some Marines dedicated themselves to desecrating the bodies of their enemies. This sinister action still weighs like a dark stain on the United States, which is ashamed of the atrocities committed by its soldiers. In this military history video, we will try to unravel the mystery behind these acts of vandalism that make us wonder if such brutality and savagery are central elements of human behavior. We warn you that today's delivery challenges the limits of cruelty, so we recommend caution.
Shit, I forgot about that guy. Tap's got a shitload of gold in his teeth. Gold is what, 30 bucks an ounce?
The Second World War was a conflict that did not only take place in Europe. Asia was also the scene of brutal slaughter and devastation. On the battlefield, where the roar of weapons and the clamor of war deafen everything, acts of barbarism took place that still resonate strongly today in the testimonies of those who lived through them. Among them are the chilling confessions of American soldiers about the mutilation of the bodies of fallen Japanese troops. These are the true voices of horror. Their stories, imbued with pain and remorse, are capable of transporting us to a macabre and incomprehensible scenario. Grotesque scenes of scalping and desecration of corpses emerge from their memories. These testimonies challenge the understanding of the human psyche, which is capable of breaking the limits of evil in combat conditions. One of these heartbreaking confessions comes from an American soldier who, in a letter to his wife, crudely recounts the mutilation of a Japanese enemy. "I cut off his head and carried it with me for a while. Then I threw it away." His words, laden with a mixture of pride and horror, reflect the dehumanization that permeated some sectors of the American Army in the Pacific. This cruel testimony was collected in the first clashes between the Americans and the Asians. Another soldier coldly describes the practice of turning Japanese heads into household items. "The skulls made pretty good ashtrays. We used to cut them in half and then polish them." His account, stripped of any trace of empathy, tells of the deep hatred and dissociation in which some soldiers who were on the front lines found themselves immersed. However, in the midst of these atrocities, we also find voices that were raised to denounce these acts of madness and savagery. An American sergeant reacted with horror to the mutilation of a Japanese soldier by his commanding officers. "I was sickened. I couldn't believe what I was seeing." Although this is a brave testimony, it is terrifying to think that this dissenting voice was an exception to the rule. The most common accounts repulsively tell of how the Marines desecrated Japanese bodies in unimaginable ways. In conversation, soldiers cynically called them trophy corpses. Far from honoring the dead, some resorted to macabre practices that turned corpses into grim spoils of war. One of the most common was the extraction of ears and teeth from fallen Japanese soldiers. These body parts were collected as prizes and sent home as morbid souvenirs or even turned into gambling objects. The dehumanization of the enemy was such that their remains were seen as worthless items, stripped of any dignity. Let's watch a chilling recreation.
Christ, put him out of his misery! F*** off!
Makes it easier.
Another bloody practice was decapitation, loaded with primitive symbolism, intended to terrify the enemy and demonstrate American military superiority. The most exemplary case was photographed by a correspondent for Life magazine. The portrait is heartbreaking, the severed head of an enemy at the foot of an American tank. It is at these moments that one understands the value of the phrase, "A picture is worth 1,000 words." The desecration of bodies was as common as it was despicable. Japanese corpses were mutilated, their eyes were torn out, their tongues were cut out, and other atrocities were carried out. The most symbolic and reprehensible were urinating on the bodies or raping the remains of Japanese civilians. These actions, driven by hatred and thirst for revenge, sought to humiliate the enemy and deny them peace, even in death. Among the most extreme cases, there are those that tell of some Marines carrying out these ruthless practices on enemies who were still alive. The screams of despair and pain of the victims still resonate in the nightmares of those who feel guilty for the horrors committed. It is valid to ask, at what point was the seed of hatred planted that engendered these inhuman acts? Nations faced each other in a merciless fight on the battlefield. However, there were fights that took place in other areas. Hatred and propaganda were one of the most powerful weapons during the war. They were not only directed at political enemies, but also focused on specific ethnic groups. Among them, Japanese soldiers were victims of one of the largest campaigns of dehumanization and racism by the United States. Among the elements used as publicity, there was material filmed by the soldiers themselves on the battlefield, where they objectified enemy combatants. American propaganda at the time portrayed the Japanese as wild animals, inferior beings incapable of understanding the norms of civilized warfare. However, this was just an excuse for the American media to justify extreme violence. This objectification, spread through posters, films, and speeches, sought to support contempt for the enemy. Pre-existing racism in the United States also played a crucial role. Discriminatory norms, such as the Asiatic Exclusion Act of 1924, had created a climate of hostility and prejudice towards people of Oriental origin, especially Japanese, which intensified during the war. The necessary breeding ground for resentment and racial discrimination was there. The mutilation, desecration, and macabre trophy collection we have discussed became a way of expressing hatred and perceived superiority over the Japanese. The rawness of combat in the Pacific, where each side inflicted terrible losses on the other, also fueled a desire for revenge and brutality. In this context, a treasonous war crime would forever mark the relationship between the United States and Japan. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 marked a turning point in World War II. The fury and pain that this act inflicted on the hearts of Americans ignited a desire for revenge that spread to the battlefields in the East. The way of expressing anger and the desire for revenge for the attack on the American naval base, as we have already seen, is one of the most atrocious recorded throughout the history of the 20th century. The mutilation of enemy bodies not only violated the basic principles of international law and the conventions of war, but also fueled a cycle of violence and hatred that could only lead to more suffering, from which it seemed impossible to escape. It is essential to emphasize that these atrocities represent the behavior of most American soldiers, but not all. Many of them fought with honor and respect for their enemies, even under the judgmental gaze of their comrades. This also meant danger, as many Marines were capable of torturing their compatriots, accusing them of being traitors to the nation for not humiliating the remains of the enemy. This clearly shows that the wounds of battle are not only physical. The traumatic experiences of war also deeply marked the minds and psyches of the soldiers who fought. Constant exposure to death, horror, and dehumanization had a devastating psychological impact on many American Marines and pushed them to the brink of insanity. It is known that post-traumatic stress, anxiety disorders, and depression were common companions of combatants returning home after the war. The atrocities they witnessed and committed left indelible scars on their souls, tormenting them with nightmares, repetitive memories, and feelings of guilt. However, little is said about the fact that these psychic disturbances also operated on the battlefield. These mental imbalances created the perfect scenario for the American military to give in to their basest instincts. How else can we explain the action of having a dying enemy on the ground and cutting off his cheeks from the corner of his mouth to his ear in order to extract his teeth as a trophy? It is clear that we are not justifying this action in any way. Just as we explain the racism present in the imagination of the combatants, it is about giving the full context in which these atrocities occurred. Another existing element, which is fundamental, is that the Japanese imperial troops were as ruthless as their enemies. This fueled the fantasy that the Japanese were wild animals who did not deserve gestures of humanity. Motivated by the atrocities committed by Japanese militias, such as the Nanking Massacre or the brutality in the Solomon Islands, some American soldiers resorted to the barbaric acts we have described above as a way of balancing the scales. It is true that American prisoners were also humiliated by the Japanese army and executed in brutal ways, as shown in one of the most famous photos of the Pacific War, but unfortunately not the only one to recreate the atrocities that the Japanese committed with American corpses. However, this is by no means a justification for the American response. The idea that mutilation was a form of just retribution for Japanese crimes spread among the troops, fueling a cycle of violence that escalated to unthinkable levels. Let us remember that these extremely brutal rituals were not private acts. They were widely celebrated within the squadrons, and the trophies or loot were proudly displayed as medals of honor. It was a common and terrifying sight to see the entrances to the camps decorated with skulls, ears, teeth, and eyes taken from desecrated Japanese bodies. This speaks to the fact that the soldiers were not victims of a violent emotion, but rather enjoyed and planned the acquisition of these sinister treasures. Among other unlikely actions, the Marines blew up enemy corpses to share the loot, as we will see in the next video. The motivations behind these actions were complex and diverse. Some Marines sought to preserve a memento of the war, a tangible proof of their participation in the conflict. Others saw these objects as victory medals, symbols of their superiority over the enemy. The creation of these macabre souvenirs varied according to the creativity and brutality of each soldier. As we have already mentioned, some limited themselves to removing ears or teeth from the bodies and making necklaces or amulets from them. It was very common to send these crafts to the family. The anecdote of a mother who received a Japanese ear and decided to nail it to the door of her house so that the neighbors would know that her son was a hero is incredible. The madness of war was not only found on the battlefield. The Marines who practiced decapitation kept the heads as grotesque trophies. They usually took care to get rid of the flesh and skin because it was very inconvenient to have a souvenir in a state of putrefaction. The techniques used were to put the loot on a bonfire and wait for the fire to do the work, or to leave them out in the open and let the ants eat the flesh. Once the skull was free of tissue remains, it was thoroughly cleaned and then treated with caustic soda to make it shiny for display. The most creative soldiers made ashtrays or ornaments from the skulls. A photograph, as terrifying as it is illustrative, shows a young American woman studying with a Japanese skull on her desk, a gift from her boyfriend who was still at the front. But this was not the only case.
Simon Harrison, the writer of Skull Trophies of the Pacific War, Transgressive Objects of Remembrance, recounts the story of a Japanese skull gathered at Guadalcanal that one Marine handed down to the next generation. Nicknamed Oscar and autographed by dozens of servicemen, the skull had been lacquered and occupied a middle-of-the-shelf place of honour in the collector's home.
Hands, legs, and other body parts were also cut off. The bones were then used to make other crafts, such as ornaments, daggers, or utensils. It is said that in 1944, then-President Franklin Roosevelt received a gift that made his blood run cold, a letter opener made from the arm bone of a Japanese soldier. The gift, from the U.S. Representative Francis E. Walter, not only offended the president's sensibilities, but also unleashed his anger. Roosevelt immediately ordered the object to be returned and demanded that the fallen soldier be given a proper burial. Although the authorities preferred not to condemn the savage actions of their troops, they had to take reprisals for the constant reported cases that continued to occur, with increasing intensity, and that generated indignation in society. The High Command of the United States could not remain impassive in the face of each one of the barbaric cases. Measures were taken to investigate these war crimes and punish those responsible. However, the response was neither constant nor forceful. In some cases, soldiers who mutilated or desecrated Japanese bodies were subjected to courts-martial and sentenced to punishments ranging from dishonorable discharge to prison. But in other cases, investigations failed, or punishments were extremely lenient, sparking controversy and criticism. The reasons for this disparity in retaliation are complex. Difficulty in gathering evidence or a lack of witnesses hampered the identification and prosecution of those responsible. In addition, social or political pressure may have influenced the authorities' decisions. Let us remember that the majority of society regarded the Japanese as subhuman due to prevailing propaganda. It is relevant to note that, despite the inconsistencies in the official response, the atrocities committed against the bodies of Japanese soldiers were not at all tolerated by the American authorities. Efforts were made to investigate war crimes and punish those responsible, thus setting an example for the citizenry and military troops. Far from being isolated acts, however, these outrages were repeated on various battlefronts in the Pacific until the end of the war. From the Solomon Islands to Okinawa, American soldiers mutilated Japanese bodies with alarming frequency, creating an atmosphere of terror and brutality that characterized some of the fiercest fighting of the war. Understanding the motivations behind these moral outrages requires delving into the complex minds of the soldiers who committed them. Influenced by a combination of factors, including the shock of war, the denaturalization of the enemy, propaganda, and the pursuit of trophies, some Marines justified their actions under a variety of premises. Constantly exposed to death and violence, they may have resorted to extreme acts of body desecration as a way of coping with the trauma and dehumanization that surrounded them. Only this explains the repeated images that came from the battlefield. However, it is important to recognize that these explanations are not excuses for the atrocities committed. Violence against the bodies of fallen enemies is never justifiable and only creates more pain. In analyzing the motivations behind these acts, we seek to understand the context in which they were committed and to learn from the lessons of the past. War, with its crudeness and violence, can dehumanize individuals and lead them to commit terrible actions. While it is true that at the time some Americans rose up against these savage acts, Most veterans remained silent for decades, haunted by the ghosts of their actions. It was not until many years later that some ex-combatants finally found the courage to express their regret. In his 1981 memoirs, American biologist E.B. Sledge describes gruesome scenes he witnessed on the battlefield. Soldiers cutting off the hand of a dead Japanese, urinating in the mouth of another corpse, and shooting a defenseless old woman. The retired Marine's reflection was blunt. The fierce struggle for survival eroded the appearance of civilization and turned us all into savages. Such statements echo rumors, such as that American soldiers used dogs to dismember the bodies of fallen enemy troops. The scars of war were not limited to the memories of veterans, but there are obvious marks that will never heal. In 1984, when the remains of Japanese soldiers were repatriated from the Mariana Islands, a chilling discovery shook the community. Approximately 60% of them lacked a skull. A similar event was repeated in Iwo Jima, where numerous mutilated corpses of Japanese soldiers were also found, with their heads missing. To this day, the United States still feels shame and remorse when talking about this subject. The Japanese, on the other hand, faithful to their philosophy of life, suffer in silence from not being able to mourn their dead in a dignified manner. The Japanese know that the war crimes committed by themselves have been just as inhumane as those of the Americans. For that reason, they try not to upset the balance, sharing a guilt that will never be settled. After having narrated this terrifying and little-known face of the Second World War, it is time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for accompanying us to the end. We look forward to seeing you in our next video.